screen, and is our friend from Zakarpattia, will he be joining us?
No, right now they're not.
Hold on. Okay, so then we actually, you will have the full, yes, you'll have the full amount to yourself. Can we ask our dear audience that's still conversing in the side rooms to come into the main hall so we can start? Well, remind me, were you here in 2005 when we had the business conference? I know that we've had you several times here.
After 12.
After 12, because I had thought that you were one of the veterans here when we packed 300 people into this place, plus a translation booth. We did that. Okay, so now I'm giving it over to you because I know that we're back for time. That's it. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. Truly appreciate the opportunity to moderate a panel, which I think will be an interesting discussion. We're going to take a little bit of a different angle, and we're going to have a discussion around the topics of what, who, how, where, and when. And if we work this properly, it will be engaging with the audience, including those two guys that ask tough questions right here. We might as well just put a microphone next to them. What I'd like to do is to get us started with a short little video that Roman Fedorovich suggested. Afterwards, we'll make introductions. The video is intended really just to set a little bit of tone for what we will be talking about in terms of the agriculture sector and Ukrainian recovery, rebuilding recovery. So on the video, if you could please roll the video. This is, again, the video was meant just to set a context for discussion. Allow a couple of quick introductions here, and then we'll get started. As Flip mentioned, I'm a partner at PwC, focused on consulting solutions, and my specific focus is business combinations and business separations. So I work in the M&A space, which I believe will be quite important in terms of attracting investment to Ukraine and then making that investment work properly. My role here is to be a moderator, and we have a couple of what I'm going to call on the ground experts in the agriculture sector. So what I'm going to do is to try to drive this discussions in the form of just a little story back to my business school days. I studied under Professor Edwards Deming, and he had one great comment. He said, "You know, I don't know the answers. I just know the questions to ask." So if I can be 5% as good as he was and ask the right questions, then I think we're going to have a pretty good discussion. I'd like to set the start here with a couple of slides, just again to set context. We set tone. Now let's set some context. And under the other slides, so we can put it to the audience. Yes, please. Here we go. They're live. So first, as an introduction, Dmytro, if you wouldn't mind spend a minute just to introduce yourself, and then we'll get into more content later.
Thank you so much. It's my honor to be here. So Dmytro was the head of Ukrainian Business and Trade Association before the war, we mostly a little bit interested of Ukrainian business outside the country. Now we are lobbying Ukraine inside and outside.
Thank you. And Romana, I think you're on screen above us here.
Good day, everybody. Roman Fedorovich. I've been in Ukraine for about 31 years. I've been in various businesses, but for the last 15 years, I have been in agriculture. I actually helped formulate one of the largest agricultural holdings called Ukrainian Agrarian Investments. But now I do my own farm. Personally, it's an organic farm in the Rivne Oblast, which is about 5,000 acres. And the reason I asked Lev to play that video, if I could just digress for a second, is that I am also an advisor for the Makariv region. And my esteemed colleague, Roman Zvaric, who was Minister of Justice back in 2006, and I helped the Makariv district actually get a 16 million euro grant from the EU regarding rebuilding 2 large kindergartens, one for 650 children, one for 350 children, a large remodeling of a school that was very severely damaged, and also of the main hospital. So the point is that rebuilding has started. It's extremely an arduous process. We were at this for about 9 or 10 months. So just wanted to throw that in there. Regarding the agriculture, I'll wait for the questions from Lev and hope to talk soon.
Thanks, Roman. And we will be on that. We will be on this wavelength of the reconstruction has begun, and we'll turn that into a focus on ag sector here in a second. So if it's flipping through a quick couple of data points here. So $8.8 billion total damage to the agricultural sector. That's quite a bit. That includes damage to equipment. That includes damage to infrastructure. It includes stolen or destroyed products. It includes destroyed farmland and other damages. The sector in numbers on the next slide is population of 600 million people. And we'll make a point about that in a second, but 41% of Ukraine's exports are agriculture related. 70% of the territory is farmland, and that includes the now newly occupied territory as well. And as most of us know, a very large percentage of the world's best soil or topsoil, black soil, is on our lands in Ukraine. The 600 million is important because what I'm going to do to start the context of the discussion here is to say the world needs Ukrainian agriculture. So just let's remember that the world needs Ukrainian agriculture. Next slide. I'd like to throw out a bit of a hypothesis just to get us thinking. It's in the future, the priorities haven't changed much from where the agriculture sector has gone since 1991. So since 1991, the agriculture sector has been steadily improving, with significant improvements between 2010 and 2021. That modernization needs to continue. I have not heard many arguments against that. We'll discuss a lot about diversification of export routes, especially now with the acute situation that there is zero access to ports, basically zero access to ports. What do we do about that? What are some of the questions we're going to discuss? What are some of the short-term needs versus longer-term expectations? We'll talk about direct financing of small and medium farms and what is the importance of small to medium business in the scheme of recovery and reconstruction, and also what I'll say future economic stability as well. And then also in the future priorities, we have the increasing the value add content, which the prior session also talked about. My hypothesis for immediate needs, the demining is critical. And then also understanding where there is land that is not currently used for farmland that can still be cultivated. Monitoring and evaluation of funds. We talked about a lot about there is money there's money that is looking for a place in Ukraine, but there are people that will say it needs to be evaluated and monitored to make sure it's used properly. And then also just ensuring the supply currently the need for seed and equipment to make 2023 a successful harvest. Next slide is the value prop. Again, as I mentioned, the world needs Ukraine. The government of Ukraine has set out a number that says there's about $34 billion worth of potential investment, and that's in sight as of today in today's eyes. Just places where money could go, where funding can go, and investment is new agro tech, new technologies. But I also like to get us focused on the 8.3 million households who run small farms, who also manage to feed their own communities and operate at a completely different level than what I'll say the macro businesses do. And when looking at Ukrainian agriculture, we're talking about centuries of accumulated knowledge, what we call tribal knowledge of somebody's own land, which is an incredibly important factor. And of course, there is strong support from both government and international partners. So I know I'm talking fast, just wanted to kind of throw a few things out here. If I can throw out one other concept here, Ukrainian agriculture sector is looking for help. I believe it is not looking for charity. It is looking for investment. Charity implies cost, investment implies return. So what I'd like to do over the next 45 minutes or so is if we could have a discussion to really help people understand how we can invest in Ukraine, what types of investments are needed, and how do we go forward from there. So allow me to start with if you can throw the next slide as the what. Okay, so this will be the order, just like Professor Zalitsky asked us to do. The what part of the agro sector is a good place to start. And I'll throw the question over to you, and please, if you can get started.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for presenting in a brilliant way agricultural sector, but I will change a little bit the wording. But the question, the first question is crude. And we need to understand that we have three layers. At first, we have two layers: a strategical layer, and we have a practical, or to say, technical level of issues and problems. And I'm talking about strategical level. This means we need to understand what happens in general with the Ukrainian agriculture, and we need to talk about government, about legislative acts, about mistakes which were made before, about political and military risk insurance for investors. When we're speaking about technical problems, we can talk about what has to be done exactly for every small and medium farmer in Ukraine. And we have to do something to develop rural territories of Ukraine, remembering questions of demining, shortage of fertilizers, logistic issues, and so on. So just make a couple of steps back, if I may. In the last year, the war showed the biggest issue and problem in Ukraine. The first one was, and actually it's good that our panel is between infrastructural and energy. Because without energy and infrastructure, there will be no sustainable agriculture. And we definitely need to understand that only with the renewable energy, green energy, and good infrastructure regarding logistics, we can think about future of the project. Because you can see the ports were blocked. And when the ports were blocked, all the exports from Ukraine went through the very thin bottleneck to European Union.
Yes.
And that means that logistics skyrocketed. I don't know, does anybody know that this room or not, but even containers, even the question of carriages, the questions of small boats going through the river was an issue. And that means that our prices of agriculture went up. So, and here, from this first issue, you can understand what we have to do in the beginning. We need to create logistics. We mustn't rely on ports, never ever in the future, because with such a neighbor, we need to create another diversified ways to export Ukrainian energy prices. The second issue is the question of storage facilities. The United Nations made a good job with all those leaves to store Ukrainian grain. But is it sustainable? Will it work next year? The biggest question for the Ukrainian farmers in this year will be to see or not. So we need to think about those storage facilities which will be on the borders, which hopefully will not be affected by the war. The third one is the question of fertilizers. Yeah, as you know, that most of Ukrainian fertilizers were obtained from actually Russia. The two biggest Russian companies. Yes, it's true. Only those two Russian companies have their diversified infrastructure for supplying fertilizers for agricultural companies. So the question will be, who will come instead of them? The fourth problem is the problem of transportation. You know that 70% of the agricultural sector of Ukraine is really on Kamaz and Mas. Kamaz produced in Russia, Mas produced in Belarus. So who will be the carrier, the transportation trucks for Ukrainian agricultural products in next 5-10 years? Another problem, the problem of transits and access to the markets. When the war started, actually our main lobbying efforts were concentrated on lobbying even the possibility to transport Ukrainian agricultural goods to the territory of the European Union. We spent 3 months to make the European Union to open this transit corridors. So when we're talking about strategic level, we definitely need to return back to the question. Food, we need to understand that there is things in Reconstruction which has to be delivered by government. And that's access to the markets, that's making work on the states to protect investors somehow in a way of insurance, if they will invest in Ukraine, if they will supply something to Ukraine, they have to be protected for all the political and military risks. And the question of demining definitely is for us today also, because in a huge amount of territories, I would say it's filled with all this stuff. And with the legislation acts and best world practices in policies. 80% of legislative acts in agricultural sphere in Ukraine were designed in the Soviet Union. Even after 10 years, sustainable work on adopting legislation when we to European or international standards, we obtain only, you've done only 30% of what we have. And it's only in SPS. In agricultural legislation, European Union places simply one, because a lot is still from the period of Soviet Union. So this is some strategic corruption. Agricultural companies cannot deal with corruption, actually. And the question is how to deal with it. Here's the role of civil society, the transparency and the controlling role of civil society. So, sorry for changing the order, but I think that the question who, and as it was stated before, this unique combination of business-led, controlled by civil society, business and government partnerships with the Union of West the West would be the only one possible positive results in rebuilding Ukraine from the
Thank you, Doug. This is a very good intro, and I also see a role for private sector here, in particular your when you talk about the replacing the supply of fertilizers, the replacing the supply of equipment. Absolutely potential for Western and other part of the world investment. But I'm gonna throw the same question to you, kind of your from your perspective as a private farmer as well. You own your own farming businesses, so I think you have a very particular view you can share, and also your broad perspective on which part of the agro sector should really where should we start?
Well, since I live here and I experienced the war on a daily basis, including, well, there was a siren as late as, well, as early as 3 to 4 days ago. And with a number of drones coming into Kiev with quite good success from the Ukrainian army on taking them down. But what's bothering the farmers out there, because let's face it, the majority of the farmers in Ukraine have not been affected by the war, by the actual fighting, but they've been affected by something else far worse. Well, in a matter of speaking, Ukraine used to produce about 75% to 80% of Ukrainian production is exported, and 90% used to go through the Black Sea. Now that had now since only 3 out of the 9 ports in Ukraine kind of are working, and that's on a very minimal basis, that overloaded the rail and trucking system, doubling and sometimes tripling prices and making enormous lines at the borders. Some trucks were standing 10, 15 days, 20 days to cross the border. And that just drives, like, for example, prices, well, let me just give you another number. In 2022, we're left with this year from 2022 about 10 million of leftover stocks that have already put a huge capacity burden on the elevators that are existing. Many are running out there trying to buy as many of the silo bags, which is one of the technologies that our people are bringing in here to expand their temporary storage facilities. But that's a huge problem. And trying to make some money is the biggest problem, because last summer, when at the peak of the prices, wheat was selling for about $360 a ton in Europe. But the prices in Ukraine were hovering under $200 a ton. So that left about $150 going to traders, logistics, and just causing terrible losses for many farmers. And they're looking at the same thing right now coming into this year. So I just wanted to put out there what the immediate problems are, and that is the logistics issues. Solving somehow the ports, and somehow putting more capacity into rail and into trucking. And that means also helping the bureaucratic things at the EU borders. For example, 4 days ago or 5 days ago, the Polish farmers blocked all the border crossings into Poland. A few days later, it was the Hungarians doing the same thing, and the Slovakians. All those trucks are now standing there waiting, even though 90% of that grain was destined for transit into Italy, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and so on and so forth.
Well, thank you, Roman. And I think we have consistency here in our response. I think, if I heard correctly, we have logistics is a very high priority to start, and storage facilities. So I think both of you were incredibly consistent in that. Let's maybe take this apart. Let's double click on this a little bit. And I know I'm going to actually throw this one over to Roman to start the next level of discussion here. Victoria, you had mentioned that there is a government role and a civil society role. I think we're talking broadly strategically here. Roman, how do you see if you were pressed against the wall right now to say, let's throw a hypothesis out there of how we can affect the logistics challenges in the short term? What can we do in the short term, and who should be driving that? And that'll include, let's include the storage facilities as part of the broader infrastructure logistics for agriculture.
Well, like I mentioned before, I think for example, Ukrzaliznytsia or Ukr has already started to expand their capacity. The roads need to be, the border crossings need to be, the capacity needs to be increased, and as much lobbying with the EU to prevent these bureaucratic, artificial stops at borders in order to keep everything moving. Because even with that, all working at substantially higher levels than in 2022, we're still going to be having the enormous issue on grain storage. Maybe some of the fact that we've had a month of rain and even places down in the south have not really started planting because they're, everything is wet in the whole country, starting in, I'm in Rivne Oblast, all the way down to Odessa. All my farmer friends are standing around trying to get into the fields to plant. So there will be less ground planted, and there will be less everything planted because people just don't see a way to make money with the current pricing that's out there due to the logistics. So in my opinion, it's got to be working on the road capacity and possibly on the rail capacity as well.
I sense the consistency here that the government has a big role here in terms of driving the beginnings of that, and also state-owned enterprise can drive the beginnings of that.
Can I jump in for a second though? The overwhelming best thing to do is to push the Russians out, and all of a sudden the Black Sea opens and everybody's working and everybody's happy. Problem solved.
We'll make sure that the report on it has this as a primary recommendation. First up, thanks so much. Would you like to add on to the thought of, again, specific next steps here in terms of improving logistics and the storage?
It's very easy or complicated. I will not rely. The first thing, I will not rely on ports never ever in the future to. So we have to have at least several logistic channels out of the country. And one thing is which government can do, and actually definitely that's the job which government has. It's the question of trust between customs of border member states of the European Union and Ukraine. The easiest way to create this trust is synchronization of the systems, is connectivity. The same, the trust between control systems of European Union and Ukraine. So I'm talking all the time about European Union, but actually it's the only one way to take products out of Ukraine. So the question of trust to controlling systems, of SPS systems and Ministry of Agriculture, because only synchronization of trust can make the issue where the flows will go quickly from one state, meaning from Ukraine, to others. The question of fight with corruption is obvious. So why not to invite inspections from European unions or even from United States actually with best practices to Ukrainian border? That's issue number 4. And maybe the last issue, issue number 5, as I told, is the question of insurance. One of the biggest holdings which I advised for the last 7 years in foreign policy and foreign trade told me that in July, the Maersk container, if they needed Maersk container to come inside Ukraine, they had to place a deposit of 25,000 euros for each container. It means that all the countries and all the insurance companies are afraid of a war zone. So without specific legislation and without specific insurance instruments, which will give possibility for foreign insurance companies or to work with Ukraine or to have a hedge fund, which actually this question rises in the last 6 months, and maybe it will be created. Without insurance for logistical companies coming inside Ukraine, it will be quite hard to ask transnational shipping companies to operate on a low price and quickly inside Ukraine. So this is at least some of the practical things which can be done immediately.
I think it's a good transition into the next topic, which is the how. What are the sources of seed money funding, and how do we encourage investments? And maybe let's start. I'm going to start. you are a lobbyist and you work with different governments. How can we best encourage somebody to underwrite the insurance? What are the right steps here? And then also, we are now in the United States. What bigger role can the United States play here through whether it's through the IFIs or through even private industry?
Actually, you have the answer, and you already developed it. It's meager. So the question is, it has to be a body which will be guaranteed by Result G7, leaded by the United States. We shall make agreement with Ukraine that they guarantee losses which possibly can occur from going to war zone. The procedure has to be very clear, and especially medium and small business must have a possibility to apply for cooperation with this body, as international and Ukrainian logistics companies must have possibility to apply to this body, and that will mean that the issue will be solved in 1 month, and that will mean that we will have enough of facilities or equipment to transfer those parts of it.
I'm going to throw the microphone your way here. So same question, just the sources of seed money and funding, but maybe more from the perspective you had mentioned. You have a number of, I mentioned the 8.3 million households that are small farmers. So you have a number of your colleagues are running smaller farms, smaller businesses, and I'd like to also explore the comment you made. Some might, I'll say, put their pencil down because there's nothing to be made. What can we do to encourage, short of a miracle in terms of logistics and infrastructure, because that won't change overnight. What else can we do to encourage production and moving it around?
Well, I think as long as the war is going on, I don't think we're going to be able to really encourage production increases, because if you can't get the product out, there's no sense in it. It's more like a holding pattern right now for most farms. But the most difficult people who are being hit with this are the small farms that are under 1,000 acres or 2,000 acres. Working capital for them is basically impossible to get. Even with reasonable assets, it's usually only the well-established farms that are quite large, or the agro holdings who have access to some capital. And so, in my opinion, one of the major things is developing some kind of helping the banks in Ukraine, loosening the National Bank Ukraine requirements for loaning to some of these smaller enterprises to keep them viable. Because if they're not going to be viable, they're going to be snapped up by the neighboring farms, by the agro holdings over the next year or two, and it's going to become similar to like Argentina, where you have 10 big players in the whole country. So it's trying to keep the 50-acre guy, the 100-acre guy, the 1,000-acre guy up and operating. That's, in my opinion, that keeps a lot of people employed, and it keeps the family businesses going. And that needs, again, the National Bank of Ukraine needs to relax their requirements, and the banks need to have infusion of capital for this kind of farmer.
No, and that makes a lot of sense. And I think what we fear is seeing the industry change out of the necessity. Like you had mentioned, that the smaller players will get bought out, and that changes the entire dynamic of how decisions are made in the future as well. Allow me to take a step backwards and ask: is there anybody who has a question in the audience to throw something out to our two panelists? Oh, many questions. Let's start. Make sure we have the microphone for Roman to hear. These go quick, we'll go 1, 2, and then 3. Go back.
So a question about the exporting of agricultural product with the border being blocked in Poland, I guess, in other countries.
I thought the issue here was underpricing, that the Ukrainian exports were basically moving at a much lower price point than the local farmers, and so that turned into a political issue. Is that an accurate representation or an abstract?
Yeah.
Resolve how that aligns with some of the comments made about the logistics. Tariff.
Okay. I'll try to answer this question. The first thing, when the war starting, you mustn't blame farmers or citizens. They're surviving and they're trying to earn any money which are possible. The question is to both governments, and specifically to government of Ukraine and government, if the regulation regime was working on a normal level, if there were enough of phytosanitary and veterinary officers on the border from Polish side, if the two systems were combined between Poland and Ukraine, there will be no mistakes done like those which were in European press in the last week. I can tell you that Ukrainian government in some parts tried to solve these issues, because when there was enormous quantity of different bypassing or loopholes or whatever, head of structures, head of services called each other every day between Poland and Ukraine, transferring signed documents not to make possible all this, bypassing the procedures. But especially in the beginning of the war, it's a mentality of people. They're trying to survive in the way they can. So here is the role of government to control and to build trust with their partners.
I'd like to add to that also.
Thomas, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing fine. I want to answer that question for a second, also because.
My question is, while the war is going on, how do we increase the exports through the ports? Is that any possibility that it's a quagmire of inefficiency, or held up because of the Russian Black Sea Fleet? I would assume that the majority of Ukrainian grain goes down to Africa, the Middle East, and areas off of the Mediterranean, to various parts of the world. What's it going to take to be able to increase the ability to ship by water?
Well, instead of having Russia. Look, I think just so people understand how the grain deal works.
Now we can hear you, Roman.
You gotta let him know he can't hear you.
Roman, if you could start, we have a little bit of audio, so.
Sorry, say that again, please.
If you could please repeat your answer, because we had our audio off here, we missed your answer.
All right. Regarding Thomas's question, I don't know how everybody understands how the grain deal works, but the ships come to Bosphorus, and they're supposed to be so-called inspected by Russian inspectors, who instead of doing 20, 30 vessels a day, maybe do 1.5, go coffee break, don't come back. It's this kind of thing. So it would be helpful if maybe NATO could take this into their own hands, because the Russians are going to do this stall tactic forever. And as far as the first question goes, which I'd like to answer also, is there was quite a bit of greed taking at these border countries in Slovakia, Poland, and in Hungary. They saw an opportunity to buy at super low prices from Ukraine, hold it in stocks, and when they couldn't move it out in large quantities to the ports in the Mediterranean or into the Baltic Sea, they started dumping it into the local markets. And like always, the small guy got hurt, and that's why they got angry, took their tractors, and went to the borders.
That's a very powerful explanation. So, one of definitely the best answer for the question, of course, is US Navy to think of Russians. So definitely this will be answer number one. But answer number two is collateral ways of exporting. So the biggest volume of Ukrainian grain right now is going through Constanța port in Romania. And the logistic cruise is going through the Danube River. So if I remember well, we still need up to 6,000 barges more. And some other stuff like, for example, longing the railways to Constanța. So that's what I'm talking about, collateral logistic routes. We mustn't rely only on ports. There are some other ways of how to bypass the ports, but it means to create infrastructure. By the way, there are specific projects which are called trans-border projects between Ukraine, European, and US, by the way, can participate in creating this new ways of logistics.
Yeah, I was gonna ask a question in terms of clarification. And I'm just really happy that I've got all of really cool experts here to ask this question. I've seen in the news reports that I keep getting and so forth, that something really struck me strange, that we actually exported from Ukraine over 20 million tons of grain. Now, as I remember, but this is from our security dialogues, I remember there are three ways to export out of Ukraine. You're absolutely right. Out of Odessa or out of our great ports, then through the barges into the dam, and then obviously the rail. I'll pose, and I was going to ask you in terms of the percentage, 20 million. I'll pose the least likely, according to the security guys at the beginning of the war, was the European land route. In other words, they said that if you can't get it through Odessa, you might be able to get it through the barges and up the Danube. But the least likely was the rail because there's just not enough logistics for the rail. And yet now I'm looking at it and someone's going to explain to me, the Europeans are complaining because there's too much of this stuff going. What improved? Did suddenly we discovered a whole bunch of rail cars and we're now shipping almost all our grain through Europe, or is this like a scam? My great deputy here next to me told me that yes, there might be a bit of a scam by the Poles and the Slovaks and so on and so forth. What's going on, and what are the percentages between the barges, the ports, what they're doing through Odessa with the Russians, and what was going through the land? So I'm confused. And how is it that 20 million tons of grain are getting out? That's a lot of grain that's been produced. So go ahead. I mean,
Do you want me to answer this?
yes,
Okay, so there are definitely different routes, but you forgot the course ones.
go ahead.
Which is totally dedicated to Ukrainian creativity. When grains are supported by trucks.
Oh.
And that's unfortunately what war made our agricultural guys to do. And that's what's damaging a lot roads and everything else. That's just because we don't have enough railroads and carriages, not enough barges, and that's why if the route through the Odessa port, the grain corridor will be blocked, it will be a disaster for Ukrainian manufacturers. So yes, the biggest percentage of Ukrainian grain is still going through Odessa. The second one is what is going through Constanța. The third one through rails, and the fourth one through the trucks.
And it's the trucks that are now the follow-up is not that it's sort of suggested. Is it this new truck thing? Because this truck is now, they didn't have enough rail, so this new truck thing is what's being transported through Slovakia and Poland and so on and so forth, and suddenly has got everybody, hair on fire. Or is it what's causing that European? Because it isn't just the Poles. At first, I thought it might be the Poles and their particular approach to the land, but it's the Poles, the Slovaks. Everybody seems to be worried about the Hungarians.
I will totally rely on what Roman said on this issue.
Yeah,
Because don't forget, there are a lot of businessmen in all these border member states, and they can buy cheap grain
But that's,
They do
yes,
that business.
that's,
They do that business. If you can buy it cheap and sell it in an expensive way, why do you buy it not good?
Right.
There are questions with control, there are other issues, but the biggest issue is just what is in the human nature. If you can buy cheap, you can sell expensive, you will do it. Everybody will.
But wasn't most of that grain even by rail and trucks going not so much to the Polish part, to Poland, Hungary should have been transiting to France and Italy, so that I didn't get stuck in Eastern Europe.
The question is, with documents, so in any case, when you make a specification from Ukraine to any other member state, you need to show your final buyer. So if in the document there's Italy, you're going to Italy. If your final buyer is in Spain, you're going to Spain. And what's happening in Poland, to say,
Right.
while this grain is playing in Poland, it's not Ukrainian issues. And sometimes I think Polish inspectors need to ask their traders what's going on inside Poland.
Yeah.
How grain, which is specified to go to Italy, will be found in Poland or in Hungary.
Sorry that I took this much time.
That's okay. Good questions. And I think, again, another role for government here and for controls from international organizations. So, Leo, you had a question. It's to you.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Roland. How are you?
Hi, Mirren.
We've been talking about the, well, you asked one of the questions I was thinking of, priority of transit. I have two questions, perhaps. One, there's been a lot of press lately on the EU not wanting to accept Ukrainian grain because of pesticides. And I was wondering whether that's valid or simply Europeans protecting themselves from the glut of Ukrainian grain on the market. That was one question on the pesticides, because that's fairly active. And the second question would be the viability of storage. Because not only is there a lack of storage, my question, perhaps to either of you, you mentioned the short-term solution of the big silo bags, where you can store grain. From a feasibility perspective, if you're stuck with bottlenecks, if you're stuck with bottlenecks, if you have it in those silo bags, how long can it stay as opposed to in a normal elevator? So what's the viability of storage? What's your, what's the deadline before the grain has to move? I mean, that's for us who aren't in the farming industry. It's interesting for us to understand how long can it stay?
Okay, well, regarding the first questions, whether it's herbicides or pesticides, generally speaking, it's the same chemical companies that are, conglomerates, the Syngentas, Monsantos, DuPonts of the world, who are sitting in Paris and in Zurich, that are sitting in Kiev also. So in my opinion, I think this is a invented situation, but I don't know enough about the problem to answer it unequivocally. Regarding the grain storage, these silo bags are quite good. Now, I wouldn't leave my stuff in the middle of a field in a 300 metric ton sock for more than a year or so, but it's a good temporary fix, because in the elevators they can usually stay a year or two, depending on the grain and the condition it's in.
Thanks.
And we're winding down here at the time, so we have about 3-4 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to throw the microphone over to Roman first, and then to withdraw for kind of a last word, last thoughts. And from my perspective, I'd like also to ask if we could address what else we'd be doing in addition to pushing the governments. We talked about pushing government. We talked about controls. We talked about legislation. We understand that part of our problem is political in terms of decisions that are being taken on the borders, et cetera. We all know Obama's recommendation, which we all agree with, stop the fighting, stop the war, get the Russians out to where they belong. Those are somewhat out of our control right now. There are other people working on that. But what else, how else can we encourage investment, private investment, and I'll even say on a micro level, to help sustain that sector during the crisis of when product can't move out? And this may be an unanswerable question, but if you could each address that on our way out here, I would really appreciate that. So Roman, first to you, and then to Robert.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer the question as a matter of an investment, but like I said before, and I'll reiterate this: the most important thing right now for the guys who are really small, up to a couple of thousand acres, is that if they don't have some help in subsidizing their transportation and logistics, they will simply fail in the next year or two. Many of them will simply fail in the next year or two, and they will be swallowed up by the large and super large corporations or agricultural holdings in Ukraine. Very simple.
Exactly, I would totally agree with Roman. So we need three things. The first one is we need analytics. What we have to do for rural territories. For example, the legislation for small farmers. Banks we should come, but we will need sustainable policies for rural territories supported by US, supported by European Union, and understandable ways of subsidizing and exporting. And here is the place for private business from all the world who can do this best world practices and how to deal with small farmers. Ukraine simply doesn't have this experience.
And I think just to add to that, perhaps just some innovation around cooperatives and purchasing from the small farmers, and perhaps investors can take the risk of storage and underwrite risk of storage. So ideas like that we may need to explore and develop. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Vlatko, for the opportunity. We hope that everybody enjoys the rest of the session here. And Metro is around if anybody has any individual questions. And the Roman is always accessible when it's getting late. Katie's right. Thank you.
The best thing in the world that I've done over all these different kinds of conferences we run is to have decentralized, and especially I'm able to do that with the business community because they're self-regulating in some ways. They really are always on time. They're always to point. My friend Paul Bandrewski is smiling because he's trying to teach me that's what especially happens in banking. So I must say, man, that you've done both panels have been just absolutely marvelous, completely different approaches, but absolutely brilliant in terms of the amount of information that's been given. So I wanted to thank Juan Roman, who's back in Ukraine. I'd like to thank Lev, as always, the Price Waterhouse Cooper thing on you really fits. You really are very good at what you do. And I also want to thank Pan Moss for his insights. All of this has been just, we're live streaming as well and stuff like that. And I know that a lot of people are listening. We're really learning. This is almost as if we had 2 university courses just given to us. So with that, lunch. And I'm going to ask that we get back here, because I padded a little bit, that we get back here at least by 12:55, which is about 20 minutes. Folks, that's why it's called a working lunch, because you could bring it back to the tables. Okay, so 20 minutes, pick out a wonderful set of selections out there, and then come back. Okay, thank you.